Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, second in our autumn lecture series. Unfortunately, brought in the socially distant way. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. And no real announcements from me this evening. Just I think we'll get straight on to introducing our speaker this evening, Mr. Chris Hall. So, good evening, Chris.
Hello there.
Right, so Chris is going to be talking to us this evening, obviously, about medieval architecture in Scarborough. If you've got any questions during the course of this evening's talk, we've got the live chat window over to the side. And also we've popped an email address that's visible throughout the talk. If you email in any questions you've got for Chris during the course of Chris's presentation, then I can collate them for and maybe ask at the end. It's not a distraction to Chris because he doesn't get to see the chat or the questions coming in, so please don't be rude.
Easy questions only, please.
Yep, keep them easy, and then I can filter out the difficult ones for you, Chris. If that's okay. Okay, so I mean, obviously it's been a bit of a curtailed year for sort of archaeology. I would suggest, Chris, you've just been doing some sort of finds processing, really, is it?
Yeah, we've cancelled 3 lots of excavations, I think, at Goathland Incline Top, Brompton Castle, and the big dig in the Old Town, which of course went ahead as a digital event, and some field work we were supposed to be doing for the national park, but we're hoping to get to that in January now. So and we've got 1 or 2 ideas for next year, so perhaps things will get back to normal.
Yeah, so
by next year.
We're hoping after the new year we can get back to some kind of semblance of new normal. So I think rather than listen to me witter on, I think it's over to yourself, Chris. And as I say, any questions, keep them coming through, and then we'll speak to Chris at the end.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Simon, for that, and good evening, everybody. The talk tonight, the title is, as you can see, The Said House of William Pawlen, and that's based on a quotation in a document dated 19th of September 1459 in the White Vellum book, which tells us something about a building being put up at the time. And I'm going to come back to that document a little bit later on in my talk. The Norman kings taxed towns on the basis of their wealth. And at the peak of the 13th century, Scarborough ranked the 19th most wealthy town in England. So that demonstrates how important Scarborough was as a medieval town. But you don't get the feel of it being a medieval town. We've got the grid iron pattern of streets, which was laid out. It was laid out as a planned town. But most of the buildings, as you look through what we now call the Old Town, are 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So we don't, as I say, don't get the feel of a medieval town. Not in the same way as if you go to York, for instance, where there are many more medieval buildings. The level of survival in Scarborough is fairly low. And what I want to do tonight is to explore how we might look at the medieval buildings in Scarborough. I've used the term domestic architecture simply to emphasize that, I suppose, that I'm not talking about the 2 great medieval buildings in Scarborough, St. Mary's Church and the castle. I'm looking at more modest buildings, so I use the term domestic. 1 or 2 of them have had commercial uses as well. So what I'm going to do is begin by looking at some documentary evidence, some old images, and then I'll move on to look at some of the standing buildings that over the years the Society, particularly working with the North Yorkshire Vernacular Building Study Group, have looked at in detail and surveyed. So what I'm going to do is start with this view of Scarborough of around about 1538. It's sometimes referred to as the first map of Scarborough. That is not strictly true, because a map, the image is taken or drawn perpendicular to the Earth's surface. This is actually a view looking sort of across the town. The surveyor, the military surveyor who's drawn it, it's the technical term for it is a plat, was probably standing somewhere about where modern or present day Fallsgrave Park is. It doesn't necessarily show the buildings in the town accurately. It's a map for military purposes, so it shows the castle, which is, of course, disappearing off the top of the slide there. And it shows the churches in quite good detail. And we know, for instance, that St. Mary's there is with its two towers with the pyramidal peaks on, which Leland refers to. We know that's fairly accurately drawn, and possibly the shape of the harbour. But within the town itself, the houses and the buildings are shown representationally. Nevertheless, I think they give us a pretty good picture of what the town must have looked like and what the construction of many of the buildings would have been. I think the first thing to notice that is the large number of buildings which have chimneys. To me, that's indicative of the fact that the town, many buildings in the town, by 1538, so we're just getting out of the medieval period, but nevertheless, what we're seeing here is basically the medieval town. Many of the buildings there are burning coal, and coal would, of course, be fairly readily available because of the seaborne trade. Sea coal, it was actually called, because it's travelling up and down the coast in ships. So as we look through the town, there's a load of buildings up here, all got big chimneys, which are necessary because of the construction of buildings. If they're timber framed and if they've got thatched roofs, it's particularly important to protect them from the heat of a coal fire. I just want to look at a couple of parts of this image of the town in a little bit more detail. And the first one here is near the Newborough Bar or the Newborough Gate here. And it shows the town at this point is a lot more spaciously developed. But we can see from these little sketches of the buildings here how they're timber framed. In particular, the gable ends of these buildings, the person who's drawn the drawing has shown a timber frame construction. And this one here, the timber frame seems to go right down through the gable. I was just saying to Simon earlier, I think it's rather sweet the way he's shown this couple of people apparently walking hand in hand down the main street. Anyway, I digress. So, two-storey buildings, pitched roofs, of course, a slight indication there that they might have tiles on. There's a building here with some nice arches, which seems to indicate that it's a shop. So if we go on to the next slide, which is an image from 300 years later, it's Carter's painting of around about 1840 rather, just before the Market Hall is built. And it shows very close to where I've just been indicating a medieval house. We can see the timber frame up in the gable here and down here on the walls. A post supporting the corner, and I'll be talking a little bit more about corner posts a bit later on. There's another one here. This is clearly a shop. At this stage, this area of town is known as the Shambles. It's where the meat market is, so we could speculate that this is a butcher's shop with a feature here that we associate with medieval buildings, a pentis, which is providing a little bit of shelter for people who are coming and looking at the shop. There won't be glass in here. These are complete openings. And possibly we can't actually see fully from this drawing, but possibly the building has an overhang with a jetty. It looks as though the infilling is, in this case, brick, but that's speculation. The typical medieval form with a steeply pitched roof, And there's no doubt in this case, this building and the adjoining ones are roofed in pantiles. We can see this from the wavy line along here. So up until the 19th century, there was a lot greater survival of medieval buildings than we see now. Of course, all this area here around the Market Hall was swept away in 1853 when the new market was built, and no doubt an awful lot of medieval buildings were lost at that time. Just going on to another part of town. So this building here, the index says it's the Franciscan Friars Church, although it could be the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it's in the vicinity of St. Sepulchre Street. And I'd just like to draw your attention again to the large number of chimney stacks and this little group of houses here, which are what we call row houses. This may well be Cook's Row, or Cook Row, as it's sometimes known. Again, timber frame, gable end onto the street, but almost built in a terrace. And again, one of Carter's paintings. This is before Newborough is pushed through. Newborough is a relatively modern street, 1861, and this is the start of the present Palace Hill. So you see, these buildings would have been lost when Newborough was pushed through, but you see three gable end on row houses. This one is quite obviously jetted out, which would indicate that it's a timber framed building, probably medieval or late medieval. Again, shops, and we can speculate that these are also medieval buildings built in a row, like the ones I illustrated round about the St. Sepulchre Church. It's worth saying it at this point that the way buildings were taxed in the town was related to the way the gables were. So buildings such as this, where the gable end is facing the street, the gable onto the way, as the expression goes, they paid fourpence per house. If the gable was against the street, or the roof was running this way, the street here, they would pay sixpence. It would be based on the main street, not the side street. So that's worth bearing in mind for one or two other buildings we might be we'll be looking at a little bit later. So these documents, excuse me, show quite clearly timber framed buildings. Stone buildings were actually a rarity in medieval towns. In the 13th century, for instance, even a town as large as Canterbury, and that was a big town, could claim only 30 stone buildings. And Scarborough would be no exception to that. Stone would be reserved for quality buildings, for the buildings put up by people who were really very, very prosperous. And although Scarborough was a prosperous town, 19th, as I've said earlier, it wasn't in the top rank, it wasn't within the league of Canterbury and York in terms of prosperity. So I think it's fair to say there would have been very few stone buildings. And the documentary evidence helps to reinforce that. For instance, in somewhere between 1175 and 1195, we've got a document which is referred to in early Yorkshire charters, and that refers to the stone house which John de Beverley built by the Sandgate. It doesn't specify whether it's east or west Sandgate, which down the bottom there. So the stone house which John de Beverley built by the Sandgate. So the fact that the document is specifying a stone house seems to me to indicate that that was fairly unusual. If it had been if stone houses being commonplace, I don't think it would have said that. And similarly, in the 13th century, another document, also cited in early Yorkshire charters, refers to the great stone house in the old borough of Scarborough, which Walter, son of Goomer, the cleric, gave to Malton Priory. So again, the fact that the house is stone is important in that document. So this is the document which my title was drawn from, and it's one of the documents in the so-called White Vellum Book. The White Vellum Book contains various records for town from the 13th to the 17th century, charters, grants of land and tenements, oaths, cases before the coroner, bailiffs and other officers. And it's a very interesting document in that it's actually detailing some of the building process. And as I said, it's dated 19th of September, 1459. And later on, we'll look at one or two other buildings which are of a similar date, 1459, 1500. The first thing to see is it's referring to the perennial problem of buildings going up, where the neighbour complains that the building's not in the right place. It's set forward anyway a foot more than it was to the gate side. So those of us who've had professional dealings with buildings being erected over the years, this is a problem which is perennial. The neighbour says the building's in the wrong place, the builder says it isn't, and in this case they go before the bailiffs, or the local authorities. So setting out error refers to leads to a neighbour dispute. Unfortunately, we don't know what the result of this case before the bailiffs was, whether William Pawlen was asked to take the building down and move it back a foot, or whether he paid a fine, or whether the case went in his favour. We don't know. The first thing to look at, I think, is the reference to rights, which in this case would be house rights, a very different trade from shipwrights. House rights, carpenters and joiners who are building houses, their use of timber is very different from the way shipwrights are using it. Very often they're building in green timber for a start. So rights, sclatters and grondwallers, slaters and grondwallers, presumably they're the people who are doing what we now call groundworks, digging the foundations such as they were, and building the low plinth walls that a lot of timber frame buildings are built from. And we'll look at some of those low masonry walls a little bit later on. There's another entry in the White Vellum Book, which sets out the trades guilds in Scarborough, which includes all sorts of trades, shoemakers and so on. But the trades which are particularly associated with the building trade, it lists carpenters and joiners, carpentari, it uses the Latin, masons, latomi, painters, not clear whether that means house painters or painters of pictures, because the Latin word it uses pictores. And for the slaters, the word used is tegulari, so tegula from the Roman. That's interesting that in 1459 they are referring to slaters. There's not slates as we commonly think of them nowadays, Welsh or to a lesser extent Westmoreland slates. these would be stone tiles made from the local limestone, riven from the local limestone, probably coming from the Forge Valley area. We still find them in archaeological excavations. So even in 1459, there was sufficient houses or buildings being put up with stone tile roofs to justify a tradesman's guild being set up. So the house is set northward endway, a foot more than it was towards the gate, a foot more than it was before towards the gate side. That's the street side. And of the garth side, the corner side, 3/4 of a foot. Doesn't seem much, does it? A foot out in one way, 9 inches and in another. But nevertheless, it was enough to cause this neighbour dispute. And it said they stood before it a side house, which I think must mean a house which was set side on to the street, paying 6pence in tax, which had a cross chamber. So the house would at least be L-shaped, with a main chamber and then a cross chamber with smaller rooms in it, a bedroom above. And we'll look a little bit later on when we look at the Newcastle's packet to a building with cross chambers and a gutter with an eavesdrop upon which William Pawlen has set the gable of his house. Gavel is the gable. The eavesdrop is eavesdrop. So that's where the eaves project over to throw the water away from the house. There would be no downpipes as we now know them. The water would be thrown off. And of course, this is where the term to eavesdrop comes in. It refers to people who would shelter under the overhanging eaves in bad weather when it's raining, and they would be able to listen to what's going on inside. So that's the root of the term, to eavesdrop. And you can see it's a house which has a gavel or a gable, which would be made of timber forks. So an interesting little vignette, I suppose, of the building process that's going on in Scarborough in 1459. As I say, it would be fantastic to know what the outcome of this case was, but we just don't know that. So I want to move on now to look at a couple of buildings which, as it were, straddle the documentary or the imagery evidence with the evidence of standing structures, in that they're buildings which existed until the middle of the 20th century. They're now lost to us, but we do have some documents to show what they were like as well. So these are 23 and 25 Quay Street, which Quay Street is here, runs, for those of you who don't know Scarborough, runs parallel to Sandside, one street back from the current quay alignment, and they're just on this corner here. Little bit more detail. Ignore the black squares there. The sites of some trenches we excavated in this building, which was the Marine Engineers building. So 23 Quay Street rather, on the corner of modern Parkins Lane. That was demolished about 1922. That's here. And 25 Quay Street was demolished in June 1962. That was here. And as you can see, one of our excavation trenches, when we excavated the Marine Engineers building in 2008, actually picked up part of that building, and we'll come back to that. So just to get your bearings, Golden Ball public house on the corner here, Parkins Lane runs up past that towards the site of 23 Quay Street. And this is a Gold Gas House Lane, which leads to the parking area, which is on the site of the old gasworks. A chap called Stevenson drew number 23 Key Street in 1888, and there's quite a few things to note about that. The first is in the gable we have a crown post here supporting this cross member here, and this cross bracing, and that's a feature which is common in York but not particularly common elsewhere. And similarly, this double down bracing here of both stories is something which is common in or is found in York, again in Durham Gate, and I'll come back to that, but not very common elsewhere. I think the thing to notice also about this is that there's clearly been a shop front at the bottom there. It looks like from the drawing as if the side is brick, but if you go to some later images, so this is the early part of the 20th century. Here's Parkins Lane, here's the end of the building, and if we look closer at this image here, we can see the laths behind the plaster finish, the render, and there's no doubt in my mind that that's actually covering a timber frame rather than brick. We can see the corner post quite clearly here, and another one here supporting the jetty. The building's jetted out. It's a common practice in the medieval period, and it shows up on this photograph here that it's jetted along Parkins Lane. What I think is happening here is that Parkins Lane as a sort of public thoroughfare is relatively modern, and that actually this building is built on what's called a burgage plot. That's the way plots were laid out in the medieval period, long thin plots running back, and the tendency was in the 18th century for these plots to be built on, and what in fact had been the side yard to become an access to them. So that's the origin of a lot of the yards in Scarborough and in Whitby. They're building back along the medieval burgage plot as the main houses go out of use as single dwellings, are often turned into tenements, and the people who own them move out of town. So nice image there of a timber frame building, which we knew existed until 1922. This photograph must have taken in the 1920s. They've already begun to knock the building down, but you can see quite nice the struts here for the overhanging jetty of the upper part of the building and the corner post here. It's good to note that there's actually a gap between this arch here, which is filled in with brickwork, and that'll be something which will become important a little bit later on. So we did actually excavate on this site around about 2005, I think. In the 1920s, a garage was built on there, and then it was knocked down in 2005, and we got the opportunity to excavate there, and we find that the building was built straight off sand. The cellar was built straight off sand, which is looks like beach sand, which gave us some evidence of the key alignment moving seawards, and also some slight indication, I've yet to prove it fully, that this is one of these buildings where it was possible to draw a small boat up from the sea into the building. Something which happens to to this day in buildings in Lerwick in Shetland. It's called the Lodberries, I think, where they can actually draw a boat up underneath the building. So next door to this, that building was number 25 Key Street. And once number 23 had been knocked down and the site redeveloped for the garage, it was possible to see the side of number 25 Key Street, known locally as Crazy Cottage, probably for quite obvious reasons. This was the area of brickwork that I mentioned, filling in the gap between numbers 23 and 25. You can see the side yard to number 25, which is the area which would become the equivalent of Parkins Lane at number 23. And we can also see that the way that this 18th century brick structure has been built across the street onto the end of number 25, that the end of number 25 must have been similar to number 23. That is to say, a blind end with no windows for these rooms in the end. And some detailed work done on the timber frame, done by David Mitchellmore, has indicated that that's almost certainly the case. Rather like the Euston Arch, it was rumoured for years after this building was knocked down that the frame had been saved. And it turned up a few years ago. I think it was in a field near Rosedale, and was acquired by a timber frame building specialist called David Mitchellmore. And I believe it's still in store somewhere near Leeds, but I haven't seen it recently. You can see a little bit more detail here of how the Crazy Cottage has got a jetty here and a jetty there, and this 18th century building is butting up against it. And excavations, excuse me, just need a drink of water. Excavations carried out in the Marine Engineers building in 2008 revealed the the foundations of the building known as Crazy Cottage, and you can see here, doesn't show up too well on the photograph, but here, and there's another one here, there are slots where the ground beam of the timber frame building would have been fixed to the low stone wall. So this is the kind of wall that the Grundwallers, referred to in the 1459 document, would be building, a low plinth wall off which the timber frame building would be erected. When we excavated at Paradise in the early 1990s, I'm forgetting now, we found other evidence of beam slots for timber frame buildings. And the inner part of the building here yielded almost entirely medieval pottery. So we think these buildings are around about 1480, 1500, something like that, but no precise dating evidence has been found. So let's move on to looking at some standing structures. As I said in my introduction, we've looked at quite a few buildings in Scarborough over the years, particularly with the North Yorkshire Vernacular Building Study Group, who we worked with doing measured drawings. Doing measured drawings of buildings is a very important process in understanding them, because not only do you get a precise record, a drawn record of the building, but by standing at the building and drawing it in detail, you begin to look at it very closely, and you begin to think about how it's been put together. And very often it's possible almost to unpeel a building, as it were, like peeling an onion, peeling off the layers and understanding how it's been put together, rather in the same way as we carry out an archaeological excavation. We take things backwards. So the first two buildings I want to look at them together, are the Three Mariners and the Dog and Duck, which are just here. There's on Key Street. This is the Three Mariners, up for sale if you want to buy it. On the front street frontage here, it's looks like a 17th century building in the artist's mannerist style, with these rather nice little pedimented features, with later alterations in the 18th century when the sash windows have been put in. If you take a close look at it, you can see that the sash windows don't align with the arches for the 17th century windows. So if you just looked at this straight on from the street, you would think you've got a 17th stroke 18th century building. But in the gable end, the exposed gable end, there's this huge timber frame. There it is in a little bit more detail. It's interestingly got mortise joints here, which is something I'll look at later on, and a V there, which indicates a 5. And if we're looking at the measured drawing that we did and looked at the building more closely, you'll see that there are carpenter's marks, number 5 here, here and here. So that indicates that it is frame 5. That's not 5 in terms of that, just that particular member. We now know that that whole frame is frame number 5. We also could see in more detail the beam slots and the dowels for where adjoining bracing has gone into this beam. So that really is something to start thinking about in terms of this building. What's going on here? Beam number 5 is exposed there. Not a very good photograph, I'm afraid. It's taken copied from a slide, but that's the other end of the building from the inside. And again, the measured drawing shows the timber frame in more detail, and we get number 7 here. So the other end is number 7. And if we go on to the final drawing, these are a little bit faint because they're actually taken from the field drawings, not from the worked up ones. There's a post here. This is the earlier side wall of the building, and what you can't see from here is that's post number 6. So the Three Mariners contains posts 5, 6, and 7. It could be that it's made up of posts taken from an earlier building which has been knocked down and re-erected, and that would not be uncommon for that's the beauty of a timber frame. You can actually take it down and re-erect it. And we've got in the Society's archives photographs of crooked frame buildings which have been taken down and being re-erected at Huttonley Hall Museum, the Rydale Folk Museum, when the museum's in its first stages of being developed. So if we go a little bit further on, so here's the Three Mariners, and here's the end of the building known as the Dog and Duck, which is a separate public house. And on the face of it, that seems to be a different building. It's got a lower hipped roof here, The framing seems to be different, but then we can't see the main framing at the Three Mariners because it's covered in brick nogging, as it's called, infilling, and a jetty here, corner post, and a curving brace here to support the jetty. With a comparison between the end frame of the Three Mariners and one of the internal frames of the Dog and Duck shows that the width is the same. The first floor level is the same. The ground level is slightly different because in the Dog and Duck it's modern, has been built up, but the ground beams are very, very similar in level, and the tops of the main posts are at the same level. So there's some similarities in the frames. And we now know from detailed drawing, detailed survey work, that the old Dog and Duck contains frames 1 and 2, frames 4 and 5, 3 and 4, sorry, have gone, 5, 6, 7. So we now know that the old Dog and Duck and the Three Mariners were actually one long building alongside Quay Street, and we suspect that actually, because of the jetted detail along this part of the old Dog and Duck building, that it was actually an L-shaped building. And what we've got along Quay Street is the remnants of a wing of a very, very much larger building, possibly a tavern without buildings, or a merchant's house without buildings, or a warehouse. The quality of the carving on what's called the bressumer, this beam running across here, indicates that it probably wasn't a warehouse, it was something more sophisticated to that. And a comparison has been made between the bressumer detail at the old Dog and Duck, which is shown here, and detail of a building at 45 Goodram Gate, York, which is almost identical. And as we go on a little bit further, we'll see that there's further indications of some interplay between carpenters working in York and Scarborough. In this case, though, there's only the single curving down brace. So let's move on to the Newcastle packet now, which I've mentioned on a few occasions. Down here on Sandside, there it is. This building is relatively modern. This part here up to that point there, it's quite critical to know this. That part was rebuilt in 1898, designed by Frank and Sidney Tugwell. It's probably Frank who did the work, but it was the practice who submitted the plans. Typical Tugwell detail here of these chimneys. And then a bit later on, 1922, I think, Tugwell came back, Frank Tugwell, who was no longer in partnership with his brother, and built this bit here. So they knocked a building down here, and built this bit, and then knocked another building down here and built this bit. It's quite critical to know that in terms of the development of the Newcastle packet, or the medieval Newcastle packet as well. So beside the door, there's this plaque. This house is one of the oldest in Scarborough, being a frame-built house of the middle of the 13th century. That's just a load of complete nonsense. In 1230, well, stylistically, the building that stood there wasn't 1230, but in any case, in 1230, that was in the middle of the harbour. So that's just rubbish. It was the office of the justice where all tools and customs were paid, and is said to be a half bow shot from the fort. That's probably folklore. It's probably mythical. So don't take much notice of that either. It goes on to say this carving, which can be seen in the passage between this house, can be seen with difficulty, it should say, and the adjoining property is a rare and splendid specimen of ancient English art. Can't argue with that. Can't argue with it. It's a wonderful piece of carving. And then it goes on to say it represents Justitia, goddess of justice, taking toll from a fishwife's creel. While on the other side of the post, that is Kybele, daughter of Justitia, offering the vestal fire in token of honour. I think that last bit's going a bit far, but this bit, I think there's a little bit of element of truth in it. So here's Settringson's view of 1735. Here is the building the previous building on the site of what we now know as the Newcastle packet. This frontage here, this rather formal frontage with a gable next to it. It's and you can just slightly see behind there another gable. Just going off to a slight tangent, I was just looking at this a little bit earlier on, and I realised there's actually a series of row houses here facing Quay Street. So this slide shows this photograph taken about 1900. So this part of the Newcastle packet has been redeveloped, but the other part is a shop, and you can just see behind it a gable end, and that's the gable of the pre-existing building, and the corner post here supporting the jetty. So Stevenson, who did the drawing of 23 Quay Street, he described the house. He says, this is a tile-built house. Don't know what that means. 2 stories, the chamber story overhanging. The ground plan is a front with 2 wings. So in his time, you could see the wings. The latter being roofed with gables to the front. Roofs are extremely steep in pitch, and no doubt originally covered in thatch. Well, I think that's doubtful. It goes on to say that there is no internal evidence of the age of the building, and it refers to the fact that the building at the far end, which we've just been looking at, was a butcher's shop to which an extra story had been added. Hence, only one of the original gables exists. Well, that is not quite correct there, in that you could actually see the gable behind. And he refers to the angle posts with what he describes as grotesque carvings, over which is a battlemented mould, the hollow of which is enriched with 4-petaled flowers. On the first chamber story, only one angle post remains, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. And he gives it a date of about 1320. Again, he's way out. It's probably still in the sea at that time, the harbour having moved progressively seawards. So one of the drawings which was prepared, Peter Bartle, the late Peter Bartle, an architect, John Petty and me, we carried out some survey work here in 1996 under extreme difficulty, and I don't have any photographs I can show you. I do have photographs, but it's so difficult to photograph down there that it's not worth showing them. And then the North Yorkshire Vernacular Building Study Group came back, and this is the result of the amalgamation of the survey drawings we did. I'll come back to these double, slightly curved braces there. Here's a detailed drawing of them, and you can see here these braces are the same as those at 45 Goodram Gate in York. A very unusual feature. The Scarborough ones are a little bit thicker, a little bit coarser. But that indicates to us some interplay between carpenters in Scarborough and York. A lot of architectural historians doubt that. To say that the difficulty of travelling between York and Scarborough means that Scarborough's buildings would have much more influence from buildings in Newcastle or Ipswich. But we know that in the time of Richard of Gloucester, that there's later Richard III, there's quite a lot of traffic associated with him between York and Scarborough. So, I think there's every possibility of carpenters working in both places. Just like to go back to the first drawing. You see on here the front, which appears on Setrington's drawing, that which was tacked on to the front of the medieval building, and you can just see the gable end in Setrington's drawing. Here are the two corner posts. The ground floor one supporting the jetty, and there would be a thing called a dragon beam, which goes off diagonally, and another corner post on the upper floor. And this is an interpretation of the building based on Tugwell's drawings and the description. So we think it had a main house body, or here an east wing and a west wing. So it's basically an E-shaped building, and I'll come on to that a little bit later on. And there's been some speculation based on Tugwell's survey as to whether there was actually a third story on the building. There either was a third story, or they had intended a third story because of this post, but never built it. Right, down the side are the remains of this timber frame, which Nicholas Pevsner says are very memorable indeed. Pevsner then lets himself down by referring to them as a crook frame, which they're not. It's a box frame. The corner post with this head here, which is supposed to be Justicia. On the upper post, you see these decorative work of vines and tendrils. This is really good quality work. A little bit closer and closer here is the image of the fishwife with her creel on the back. The hand is coming down from Justicia, taking out the fish. It could well be loaves. I'll come on to that later. And we have this drawing which was done by Clark just before the building was demolished. So this is the post we've been looking at. On the post on the other end of the building, where the butcher's shop was, there was an equivalent post with this grotesque carving here. Looks like it's somebody who's gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson, but I'm informed it's actually meant to be a jester. This is the only detailed record we have of that post. It's gone. Where it went in the 1920s, we don't know. Whether any effort was made to preserve it, we don't know. It's disappeared. That's the only detailed evidence we have of it. Carved corner posts are not unusual, but very often, like in this one at the Abbot's house in Shrewsbury, they're carved with panels with sort of decorative tracery, emulations of sort of window tracery. This one is the chantry in Sudbury in Suffolk, and that's one of the few ones with carvings of figures on the corner posts. I think there's about 3 or 4 in the country, in addition to the Scarborough one. These were very, very much more common on the continent, and as a consequence of that, people think that the Newcastle Packet corner posts, or the Newcastle Packet building generally, was influenced or even carried out by carvers from the continent, because of course at this period Scarborough has good connections with the Low Countries and what is now Germany, the Hanseatic ports and so on. However, some work by Arnold Pacey has given us a different idea of what might be happening. These are Arnold's drawings. You can't see this very well now. He's done a bit of artistic license by twisting the post, and you can see here that image is actually a man carrying a flask. This is what it's referred to as the making the offering up to the Vestal Virgins, and here's the lady with her creel, and he's interpreted the lettering as Justitia there. There's a detail of it, and here's a detail of a playing card, which was based on a medieval engraving by someone who only is known only by the initials BMX, Master BMX, sorry, BMG. And engravings by him were in circulation in England from about 1480. And we know that those engravings, which have similar imagery to these, those engravings were used by carvers in Ripon, Minster in 1489, I think in the Misery records. So what we think now, what Arnold Pacey thinks, is that the carvers who were carving the posts at the Newcastle Packet were not continental. They were actually taking their imagery from engravings which were in relatively common circulation. And obviously they've chosen something which is, there's some amusing detail really. For instance, you can see that the guy here has only got one leg. It's got a wooden leg. If we go back to this drawing here, this person here has got one short leg, looking like it's got a wooden stump. And the lady's got this very distinctive stooped posture. In this, it's thought that she's carrying loaves. The interpretation here is it's fishes, but whatever. The hand is coming down and taking its tithe of those. So fantastic piece of carving, which we're lucky to still have. And here's the interpretation of the development of Newcastle Packet. So initially, 2 cross wings and a central hall. Round about 1725, we know it's got this front put on here, but you could just see the gable. Then by 1890, it's got the new front on the other wing. And you can see the buildings had various names: Newcastle Trader, Newcastle Packet, Newcastle Tavern, then back to Newcastle Packet. And the preserved timber is in this corner here. I'm conscious that time is getting on. So here's Peter's interpretation or take on what the building might have looked like in its heyday. We know from the maps that there were steps up to it, the large-scale Ordnance Survey maps. So the central chamber and the two cross wings, but we must think there was a possibility of a third story on there. 2 Quay Street is another little survivor. It's got this, again, this huge corner post here. This was in the introduction to my lecture. This is an image taken, I imagine, in the 1890s, when the building is looking much more medieval than it does now. in what one of my tutors when I was doing my building conservation diploma described as benign neglect, a phrase I've always liked, which you can see the corner post seems at that point to have some carving on, but we're not sure of it. There's another carving, another corner post here. Just some details of the corner post, a little bit of embellishment, what's called bratishing on the post on the other side. So much more common of the type of corner posts that we would expect to see in Scarborough. The Newcastle packet is an exception. And there's the bratishing shown on the drawing. And this is the first floor plan. So that huge post supports what's called a dragon beam, which is a beam running diagonally, and there's another dragon beam there supported from the post here, and then the floor is built out from that, so that allows it to be jetted on two sides, which means it's almost certain that this building had another story. You wouldn't normally put in a huge post like that to support a jetty like that just for a gable end like that. It's almost certain that that building had another story on top, and if it's possible that a story's been knocked off this building, it's also possible that a story's been knocked off the Newcastle packet. Right, don't know what that was. Just a very quick look at the Richard III house, because this building is a complete enigma. Everything you see there is a fake, built in the early part of the 20th century. Probably a copy of what was there before based on engravings, but that's all fake. The grotesque effigy, which has subsequently been stolen, not a fake, but it was taken from Newark Castle and brought here when this building was used as a antique dealers in the early part of the 20th century. And the gable end here, this brick gable end, is probably a fake. Some of the greatest experts in buildings have looked at this. Here's Ian Patterson for the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments, working with the Vernacular Buildings, North Yorkshire Vernacular Buildings Study Group and the Society in trying to unpick this building. What we do know from doing that is that there is some medieval surviving up to ground level here and here, and that's apparent in the basement, but not on the outside. There's medieval stonework here and here, and we surmise that there was medieval stonework running here, and that the building was L-shaped. But we can't really say much more about the building than that. We certainly can't add to the story of whether Richard III stayed in the building on this site or not. Right, well, that's been a little bit of a canter through the standing structures in Scarborough. So I hope that's given you some insight into what we can understand about medieval buildings in Scarborough. So I'll finish there. That's all right. Thank you for listening.
Oh, well, thank you, Chris. That's fantastic. The sad thing about these things is that you don't get the round of applause that you so rightly deserve at the end of these. So,
I can clap for myself.
Well, that's it. A question from Mark from one of your very early slides. So the close-up showed Newborough Bar seemed to have a water in front of it. Was that that flowed to the sea? Was that a moat or a stream?
We think there was a moat there, probably tumbling out to the sea, where what's called the lounge site now is, near the top of the central tramway. but there's a large amount of artistic license in that. I'm not sure whether it ever held that much water, but there was a moat which was infilled, and that's why some of the buildings on Bar Street are only single story or very low buildings because they're on made ground.
And Stephen asks, has any dendrochronology been done on the crazy house, on the timbers in there?
No, not as far as I know. The guy who owns them, David Mitchellmore, he does a lot of work international on timber frame buildings, and he spent a lot of time out in Nepal. And I don't think he's gone to that level of detail. It would be interesting to do that, actually, just to take a core out of one of the posts, if we can find one.
And if you excuse the naivety of my question, is the timber frames, they're from the original construction of the thing? Are they just period?
Yeah, that's right. That's the beauty of a timber frame. You can actually unpick it, if you can get the dowels out, and you can actually pull it apart. It does take some doing because they built them, a lot of them with using green timber, and so they tighten up. But it is possible to take them apart. And so that is the original timber. So yeah, maybe that's a little fundraising effort. Raise some money to have some dendrochronology done.
And then just on the taxation side, you mentioned about whether it was a gable thing or facing onto the road. Was that levied by the authorities? Is that a national thing? I mean, is there scope for the local?
It did happen. It did happen in other towns.
Yeah.
But that was the local. It was the local taxation, but it wasn't peculiar to Scarborough.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that about sums it up for the questions for this evening, Chris. So thank you once again for that. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think we'll be, even if we knew about the area, I think we're going to be looking at it anew. So thank you again for that.
Well, when we can get back to doing guided walks again, perhaps maybe even next summer, perhaps we could think about doing that.
Yeah, and I think we should all be looking out for tugwall chimneys, shouldn't we? I think
we should be. Yes, that's a different lecture, though.
Right, so well, thanks everybody for joining us. In 2 weeks' time, we've got Paula Ware talking about the Pocklington chariot burial, so hopefully you'll be able to join us again then. So thank you all for joining us.